What We Cannot See Pioneers Season 2, Episode 9, Part 1. I just wanted to let you know, guys, that the reason I'm doing this in parts is because Episode 9 is incredibly long, and I don't think you want to all watch, a 30-minute or whatever video of me just reading everything out. So I'm doing this in parts just so that, you can watch them one at a time at your own whatever if you feel like watching them at all. So I'll begin. It had been quite some time before everyone in the army had composed themselves after the initial shock of seeing with their own eyes the true Biocene. When the members of the army saw that the Biocene was not attacking them outright, while they stood there, the soldiers and warriors began relaxing and looking at each other, their heart rates easing slowly back down to normal. The army suddenly was overcome with disappointment. Somehow everyone thought that they might receive answers to all of the questions they had been asking, and they believed that the Biocene was connected to their very existences. Maybe it was, or maybe it had nothing to do with them. Nothing changed the fact that no one knew what this being was, where it came from, and any of the answers to the other 1,000 questions everyone had been asking. All they were permitted to know was the physical form of the Biocene. It reached a point when the army had recovered from the shock of seeing the Biocene for the first time, and were now beginning to recall why they were here in the first place. They were not here to study the Biocene, they were not here to attempt to communicate or speak with it. The New Land Army had long ago decided it would enter the Biocene's lair for one sole reason: to kill it. "Maybe it doesn't matter if we can't answer our questions," Gutanoa said to his generals, still looking up at the towering mountain of parts that slowly swayed and pulsated in its place. "We are here for one single reason," Gutanoa continued. "We are here to kill it. Even if we have to sacrifice our answers." "How, Prime Minister, do you propose we kill that?" General George asked. Before Gutanoa could respond, the ground the New Land Army stood up began rumbling again. The members of the army were alarmed and raised their weapons in fear. Captain Mike looked down at a minifig corpse that the Biocene had used to lure them into the garage. The tentacle it was attached to suddenly twitched and wreathed in its place. Eventually it stopped, as did the rumbling of the floor. The army stayed quiet, weapons raised at the Biocene. Mike, however, kept staring at the minifig corpse. Again it twitched, and Mike shouted to the others, "Look!" The tentacle the minifig torso was attached to suddenly bolted in speed and slithered back toward the mountain of parts, dragging the dead minifig with it. The tentacle slithered backwards until it completely submerged itself within the Biocene's lower body, taking the minifig corpse with it. Earlier in their journey to the garage, the New Land Army had encountered two monsters out in the open. Prior to the monsters appearing before the army, they were met with a loud roar coming from all possible directions. Now again they heard such a roar, but it was louder, more erratic, and if it could be said, angrier. The men in the army slammed their hands against their ears as the roar erupted throughout the garage. The ground once again began faintly rumbling as the roar blasted into the air. When the roar and the rumbling stopped again, the minifig soldiers in the army regained their stances. One of the minifig soldiers, rifle aimed at a region of the Biocene's body, fired a shot. Out of a mixture of panic and lack of sureness, many other soldiers copied this, and several shots began firing off. "Soldiers, stay your ground!" General George commanded from his carrier truck. But the soldiers were not listening. They continued firing several shots, and when the bullets hit the Biocene's body, small bionicle and minifig parts flew off and onto the ground. Momentarily, there were small indentations in the mountain of parts where the bullets had struck the Biocene, but new parts from inside the mountain rose up to the surface and filled the holes. The bullets were utterly ineffective. The Biocene then made its next move. At the base of the mountain of parts there was increased movement. While the entire Biocene was slowly pulsating in its place, this particular region at the bottom of the mountain of parts began rapidly swaying and vibrating. A new form began appearing in the area that was moving wildly. It was a definite form, not the random assortment of parts that made up the Biocene's whole. This new form was slowly moving outward, out from the mountain of parts and pushing through the area that was moving. As the form moved outward further, its true shape could be made out. It was a three-legged creature whose legs were in fact bionicle arms. The torso of this creature was made from dark gray minifig parts, similar parts used in the construction of Colony Confidence. Its head, disproportionately small to the rest of the body, was a simple minifig head glazed with an expression of terror. The disgusting beast began squeezing itself out of the base of the mountain of parts until it fully emerged. A small tentacle of parts extended out from its back and fed back into the Biocene's main body. This was a monster just like every other encountered in the New Land. Only this time the New Land army actually saw how this monster was born. The mountain of parts was like a factory. It assembled a monster inside its core and then birthed it out from its body attached to a stream of parts so the Biocene hive mind could direct its every movement. "Attack!" General George shouted, and it was a sheer knee-jerk reaction to the sight of another monster. Quickly, General George realized his men had no specific orders and were hesitating in their place. Captain Mike looked to a different section of the Biocene's base. He saw another sub-monster pushing out of the Biocene's main body. He then urgently looked to General George. "General," Mike began, "the Biocene is assembling monsters inside its body. We need to have one part of our army focused on occupying them." General George turned and looked at Mike with a panicked face. He didn't know what to do or who to send to do what Mike was suggesting. Kopaka, looking at the newly forming monsters emerging from the Biocene, overheard Mike's suggestion. Kopaka was reluctant to abandon his pride as usual, but he realized cooperation with the minifigs was the only way anyone, Bionicle or minifig, would get out of this ordeal alive. Kopaka summoned 5 of his Bionicle warriors to follow him. With his men following, Kopaka went up to Captain Mike on his carrier truck. Kopaka said, "Mike, we'll engage the monsters as they emerge. I'm taking these 5 warriors with me. The rest will assist you." Mike was genuinely surprised at this sudden willingness of Kopaka, but quickly detected that Kopaka was doing this solely for his own self-preservation. Regardless, his cooperation would be necessary. "Thank you, Kopaka," Mike said, and then Kopaka and his soldiers ran off to engage the 2 monsters that had emerged. Gavla, standing well behind the rest of the army, was still in wonderment at the wealth of alien knowledge she now had at her disposal. She was standing before one of the last of a long line of cosmic super beings, and the arrival of the New Land army into its lair had incurred its final wrath. It would produce as many monsters as it had parts in its grotesque hold to build. The New Land army would never be able to defeat every monster it would produce, let alone the Biocene itself, by simply killing each monster as it came along. Gavla's understanding of what the Biocene wasn't complete, but it was strong. She might not know where this Biocene or the beings before this one's time had come from, or what their connection to this world was. But Gavla understood that Biocenes have weaknesses. The monsters the Biocene sent out into the world could be killed by cutting them off from the tentacles controlling them. This was the core of how a Biocene could be killed. In the life cycle of a Biocene, there is a point when the Biocene becomes so immensely powerful that it can merge its very being with the environment it lives in. This is why the Biocene could turn on lights throughout the house, make the ground underneath the army shake and tremble. The minifig scholar who had become a Biocene had merged with this house. The smaller monsters could not operate without connection to the Biocene. The Biocene, likewise, could not operate without connection to the environment it had merged itself with. The tentacles sticking out of the Biocene and feeding elsewhere into the areas of this house. If they could all be severed at once, the Biocene would die. Gavla knew this in her mind, but she had to act as if she didn't to the others in the army. No one knew Gavla had actually spoken with the Biocene, and the Biocene's powers coursed through her veins. "Icarax," Gavla said, nudging Icarax on the side. He turned and looked down at her. "I think I might have an idea on how to defeat the Biocene," Gavla said, full of deceit, as she was absolutely certain that her plan would defeat the Biocene. "What is it?" Icarax asked with urgency, seeing in the distance Kopaka and his men engaging the 2 monsters that had emerged from the Biocene. "I think we have to cut off every tentacle that the Biocene has sticking out of its body," Gavla said, purposefully acting with a slight lack of sureness to mask her certainty of this course of action. Icarax, not knowing this, looked up at the tentacles rising out of the top of the Biocene and into the ceiling of the garage. "Gavla, that's worth a try," Icarax said with amazement, seeing logic in this course of action. Gavla's mind analyzed Icarax. You'll make an ideal pawn in the path to my reign, Icarax, Gavla thought grimly. Icarax ran over to Prime Minister Stanley Gutanoa on his carrier truck, whose eyes were fixated on Kopaka and his men fighting the monsters. Prime Minister, Icarax said. Gutanoa turned and looked at Icarax, remembered that Icarax was one of the few Bionicles unassociated with Kopaka's Black Gear gang. Gutanoa felt a sudden level of respect for Icarax. He then said, Yes, Icarax? My companion Gavla has a theory, Icarax continued. We should try and cut every tentacle that is coming out of the Bioscene. The minifig soldiers could fire their weapons up at the tentacles reaching up into the ceiling, while myself, Gavla, and the other Bionicle warriors could try and cut down the tentacles on the ground. Kopaka and his select squad of warriors will keep the Bioscene's newly forming monsters at bay, while we cut the tentacles. Icarax, this isn't a bad idea. I'll inform my officers immediately. Icarax then went back to Gavla, as Gutanoa began relaying his plan to the other commanders. Icarax said to her, The other Black Gear Bionicles are standing over there. We need them to help us with cutting off the tentacles on the ground. Go to them and inform them, Gavla commanded Icarax. Icarax nodded and ran over to the other Bionicles, not realizing Gavla was doing nothing but standing and looking up at the Bioscene. As sure as Gavla had become of her immense power and knowledge, she was still trying to wrap her mind around the fact that if a minifig had transformed into this Bioscene, that she too might one day become something similar. Imagining herself slowly mutating into this giant beast never failed to be an alarming concept. Gavla looked down briefly at her feet. Before her contact with the Bioscene, her feet were generic, blocky feet found on many Bionicles' forms. But now, Gavla's feet had become large talons. She was alarmed. The mutation was already happening, and she had hardly even felt it. But something that terrified Gavla even more had just occurred. There was a sudden voice inside Gavla's head. It was slightly distorted, but words could be made out. Gavla then looked in all directions to see if anyone around her could have been the source of the voice. No one was speaking, at least not directly to her. Then she realized this voice was in her mind, and it was speaking directly to her and her alone. The intruders of this world attack me, the voice in Gavla's mind said. You are the Bioscene, Gavla replied in her thoughts to this voice. Yes, the voice continued. Gavla realized that the powers the Bioscene gave her did more than ensure she would slowly gain immense power. They had created a mental link between herself and this Bioscene. These might be my final words, the Bioscene said to Gavla in her head. Ensure the minifigs will perish in the coming years. I have given you the power to realize my wishes. I abandoned the minifig people long ago because their kind displeased me. When I became this, I made sure to direct my new form to their demise. Gavla then had to wonder, if the Bioscene hated the minifigs, why did it also kill Bionicles out in the New Land? She decided to ask the Bioscene this. Why then did you kill Bionicles? She asked the Bioscene in her mind. What the Bionicles are now is just as vile as what the minifigs are, the Bioscene replied. If these two races are left unchecked, they will ruin the world. They cannot coexist. I chose you because you have vision. You can change the Bionicle race and make it something worth preserving. You now have the power to ruin the wretched minifigs and lead the Bionicles to supremacy in this world. Gavla was not sure she understood this logic. The Bioscene was more now than a minifig scholar, that was so obvious. But Gavla began wondering, in this new form as a Bioscene, had the minifig scholar gone completely insane?